Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India has said that it wants to see a strong, unified and prosperous ASEAN playing a central role in the emerging dynamic of the Indo-Pacific as it contributes to the country's prosperity and security as well. Addressing foreign ministers of the ASEAN member states in Bangkok, External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar said India's engagement with the 10-member regional grouping has been and will remain a critical element of the country's Act East policy and strategy. Meanwhile, ministers from 16 Asia-Pacific countries of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership have said it is in the region's collective interest and highest priority to conclude the trade pact this year. RCEP is a proposed regional economic integration agreement among the 10 ASEAN countries and its 6 free trade agreement partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, South Korea and India. The final meeting of the RCEP will take place in Bangkok in November this year, and trade ministers are hopeful that the deal will be signed in mid-2020. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze all gamuts of the Indo-ASEAN ties as well as the RCEP. Joining me on the program today are S Jaishankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, and also Jayant Das Gupta, former ambassador of India at the WTO. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador S Jaishankar Mukherjee, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first try and take stock of Indo-ASEAN ties, because the foreign minister was there last week and he held several multilaterals and was part of several conferences as well. How did you think that went?
Well, it's a given that our relationship with ASEAN, which was always very important over the last few years, over the last decade or so, I would say, has reached a point where its overall importance politically, economically, and in every way is self-evident. Our trade with the ASEAN countries is over $80 billion, and almost everybody is agreed that that does not even scratch the potential. These are countries which are not international basket cases or anything like that. These are countries which are economically resurgent. They are in our, as I said, in our backyard. So commercially and economically, they are of extreme importance. Politically, in terms of all the developments leading to our biggest foreign policy, which is China, and therefore our interaction with ASEAN countries is very much connected with that, with all the developments connected with the Indo-Pacific and the balancing act that is going on vis-a-vis China again, and the US and other countries in the ASEAN and their commitment to keeping the Indo-Pacific and the oceans committed to freedom of the seas and security. So our the foreign policy of India in terms of looking east and now acting east, as the slogan goes, is I would say of enormous importance. I mean, there's you can adduce reason after reason, including which is not which is not often mentioned in the discourse on this. There's a very large Indian diaspora in these countries, not all the countries, but many of them. So if you consider every sector of human endeavor and national endeavor, ASEAN looms large on our horizon.
Absolutely.
And the meetings, I'll simply end by saying, if you look at the meetings that Minister Jaishankar had to go through, I think it was 2 summits, 4 conferences, and more than 18. A dozen bilateral meetings. That itself shows that across the board, our relationship there, individually, bilaterally with the individual countries, as well as with ASEAN as a whole, is of preponderant importance.
Absolutely. That having been said, Ambassador Das Gupta, there's no doubt that the relationship is extremely important, but there's also another aspect to it, like touched upon by Ambassador S Jaishankar Mukherjee, the fact that there is so much more potential really as far as this interaction is concerned. What is the problem really? Why hasn't it seen the heights that it should have?
I think there are a few factors. The first one is a lack of, let's say, overland connectivity and flights, direct flights, barring a few, like of course we have flights to Singapore, to Thailand, to Malaysia. But that is also another constraint which has been faced. The third issue is about language, and that especially in terms of the information technology enabled services and information technology, which we are trying to overcome by having people pick up another language which is used locally in many of the ASEAN countries. So these are the three factors, and of course then comes the issue of the overwhelming influence of China in the last 20 years or so, because of the investment flows that have taken place from China, and as a consequence many of the countries like Thailand, Malaysia, to a certain extent Indonesia, and of course to a very large extent Vietnam, they have become a part of the global value chain with its core lying in China. So that has enabled China to strike deeper relations with them on the economic front, trade front, and to that extent India has not really been able to fulfill its potential.
Right. So that having been said, Ambassador Mukherjee, can we overcome China's influence in the region, or we don't have to at the end of the day? Can both India and China coexist there?
Well, I think the latter part of your question is something that almost is inevitable. We will have to coexist there. I cannot, this whole business of playing catch up with China, I hear that in conversations vis-a-vis our policy in Africa all the time, ASEAN, wherever. We, I think, make a mistake in simply concentrating our commercial policies, our economic policies, perhaps even our foreign policies to support these policies in terms of what China is doing and therefore catching up with China. I think that's a losing kind of, that's a counterproductive perception. We have certain endowments, we have age-old relationships, we have we have certain strengths in certain sectors, and we should capitalize on them. We should continue to base our policies on our strengths instead of simply reacting to what China is doing in particular sectors and so on. I mean, I don't think that's the right basis for formulating policy. China's size, its deep pockets, its aggressive policies in recent years are a reality. Its growing influence in the world because of its growing economic and commercial, its money power, sheer, it's in most countries, especially in Africa, for instance, as one of my colleagues put it, China is the only cash-rich game in town. Even the West, the so-called developed West, is not being able to match it in terms of its willingness to offer concessional credits and loans and grants and aggressively push its commercial agenda. Therefore, I think to reach our real potential with ASEAN, we have to follow the traditional methods of improving our economic and commercial interaction. We have to be more competitive. Our private sector has to be encouraged and incentivized. I mean, it's all those traditional methods which we have to implement with greater efficiency. Instead of simply, looking out at what China is doing and then trying to play catch up with it.
Right. So, talking about traditional ways and traditional aspects that we need to concentrate on, are there any specific sectors going forward that we need to concentrate on as far as ASEAN is concerned, where both the ASEAN as a bloc and India can benefit?
Talking about the economic relations, I think, for one thing, there is a great deal of scope for tourism. And in fact, ASEAN already provides us with a large number of tourists, especially on the Buddhist circuit. So there are enormous opportunities there, and that has not really been fully exploited. That is one. The second aspect is about education. Many of the students from the ASEAN countries still go to Australia, New Zealand and the UK, US, for instance, for higher studies. if we could tap that by setting up, and we have taken an initiative in the form of these institutions of excellence, if this really comes up within the next few years, that could provide us with an opportunity. The third aspect is again in the case of services, where professional services like law, for instance, or accountancy or auditing, these could be leveraged, because India has certain strength in all these services. And then of course in medicine, in architecture, in engineering, because there is a shortage in some of the ASEAN countries at least in terms of skilled professionals in these areas. So this is as far as services is concerned. And then in trade in goods, we have to see the complementarities, because in many cases ASEAN has a very similar kind of a basket of products, especially in the last few years. The way Vietnam has come up, we can see that it is matching India in most of the products that India is producing. So we have to look for complementarities, and we have to get into a value chain arrangement with the ASEAN countries to leverage our plus points, our strengths, and see where we can fit in and lead to a synergy which will be a win-win kind of a situation for both.
Right. So, Ambassador Mukherjee, you touched upon this particular aspect in your opening statement, the Indo-Pacific, and how the US and India are both, heavily invested on the Indo-Pacific idea and everything that's happening there. From that perspective, how strategically important is ASEAN?
I would say extremely important from every point of view. The economic underpinning of the importance of ASEAN and Indo-ASEAN relationship is self-evident, as I said. I mean, it's not for nothing that we invited all the ASEAN leadership to our Republic Day parade as a symbol. It's not for nothing that we have an annual Indo-ASEAN summit. And if you look at the geopolitics of the area and the whole route that international trade follows from the east to the west and vice versa, I mean, that one look at the map will show you the enormous importance of India straddling the middle of that area, of global interaction, particularly in trade across the seas, which is why the security parameters, or the entire concept of security, maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region assumes importance. I mean, how we go about it, with whose partnership, how we, the elephant in the room again being China, this is really the challenge that our foreign policy faces. That's on the political side. Also, these are countries that are but China, and these are not, these are not small insignificant countries. These are countries with significant commercial and economic and political clout, and together ASEAN is a reasonably formidable political combination. In fact, they've achieved a kind of economic coordination and unity, and based on that, a certain amount of not as much, but certainly a significant amount of political, approach to things, which makes it one of the most successful groupings in the world. So to have them as friends is in, as I said earlier, is in India's national interest in every sector, in the political, security, and the commercial and economic sectors. So I mean, there are no two arguments about it. The point is, how do we, I think Jayant pointed out certain specifics to the generalities that I had mentioned. If you look at the commercial area, there's so much. I was talking about of moving forward on the natural endowments that we have, the opportunities that we have, rather than play catch up in this or that area with China. He mentioned tourism, education, medical tourism. There are a whole variety of areas, particularly in services and IT and so on, in which we stand in which the potential is very, very high and not really been achieved. So more focus on those areas, connectivity, which is absolutely key to movement in every area, including, and let's not forget, in the political area. Connectivity leads to all sorts of things in terms of bringing us closer together and sorting out problems in more people-to-people interaction, more trade, a whole lot more comfort with each other. I mean, the highway between India, Myanmar and Thailand, is a case in point. So I think what needs to be done is known. It's a question of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, moving on now from the Indo-ASEAN relationship to, of course, another important meeting that took place over the weekend, that of the RCEP. Ambassador Dasgupta, your thoughts on the negotiations at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Beijing?
There has been considerable progress in terms of concluding 7 of the 18 chapters and 3 of the annexes, which are financial services, telecom, and 1 more. But the elephant in the room is the issue of finalizing the goods part, the services part, and the investment part. The main problems that India looks at is about access, providing access, but not getting reciprocal access. India at the moment is having a trade deficit of approximately $106 billion with respect to the other 15 countries in RCEP, of which approximately $54 billion is with respect to China alone, about 12 vis-a-vis Korea, and about 10.5 vis-a-vis Indonesia, 4.7 in respect of Singapore, 3 for Thailand, etc. Now, of course, the others are not very significant because in the case of Korea, for instance, a lot of investments are taking place in India in terms of electronics, in terms of cars, other things, other industries. Indonesia, a large part of it is on account of import of raw materials. So that also could be factored in. But the main problem is that our deficit vis-a-vis China has been growing. And while we are still exporting mostly primary products like iron ore and some agricultural products of late, China has been exported finished products. And we have not been able to have market access, along with the removal of non-tariff barriers in many areas, including pharmaceuticals, dairy products, other agricultural products like soybean, etc. And there is also a problem in respect of getting adequate access in information technology and other services. And finally, there is a problem about getting visas, business visas for China. Even when we want to transact business with our Chinese counterparts, there is a problem. So all these issues have been raised last week by the Indian Commerce Secretary with the Chinese Vice Trade Minister, and hopefully these will get addressed. But as long as there is this huge looming deficit which is increasing every year, there will be reservations on the part of India to get into an agreement. And finally, I must mention that India wants to have a 15-year phase-out period whereby we get adequate comfort to bring our duties to 0. And India wants to carry out the tariff liberalization in about 80% of the tariff lines, and 74% for China and the other non-ASEAN partner countries. But the Australians, for instance, they want 90%, and they want a much shorter phase-out period for the tariffs. So there are differences even within the group, outside of the differences existing between India and China.
Sure.
So these are some major issues which we will have to overcome before we see the conclusion of the agreement.
All right. So the trade ministers, Ambassador Dasgupta has pointed out all of the issues really as far as RCEP are concerned very beautifully. The trade ministers, however, want the deal to be done and the negotiations concluded by the end of this year, because they have said that it is in collective interest and it's the highest priority. Do you see that happening, considering there are so many differences? Because not just India and China, even Japan and South Korea have differences and so on and so forth. So do you see that happening?
I would very much like to defer to Jayanto on this, because he has dealt with the problem. He's the expert on the subject. My feeling is, in terms of having been involved in negotiations with elsewhere, I don't think it's going to be easy. Certainly not everyone in this group of 16 has the kind of enthusiasm, the statement you referred to about giving it the highest priority. And but more importantly, as far as India is concerned, Ambassador Dasgupta pointed out very, very specifically what are our problems. Basically, there's one more that I am aware of, which these specific instances actually give more examples to, which is that the Indian industry, the big players and the medium-sized players in India, in terms of manufacturers, in terms of traders and so on, are all ranged against the RCEP. I saw a news report which talked about the Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, having interactions with, with our commercial players in every sector prior to this RCEP meeting in China, where in every single meeting he was met with a huge kind of opposition to the RCEP by the Indian businessmen, because of just one factor, which is this feeling that they have that India would be swamped with Chinese goods if we had more free trade agreements such as RCEP. Now, I frankly, without being an expert on this, I frankly would tend to feel that this needs greater examination. After all, when we liberalized in 1990, 1991, because we were almost forced to do so, what actually happened was a complete positive change in the Indian economy, our mindset. Liberalization led to, I would say, a new India with the departure of the licensed quota Raj. And therefore, the fears of the Indian businessman is always there in terms of foreign competition coming in. And yet, when these things are done, our businessmen, our industrialists, our economic players learn to compete. They learn to compete globally, and good things happen to the country. But quite apart from this aspect, about wanting to take our own businessmen along, which seems to be a little difficult, the main difficulties are what he pointed out, which is, I think we are not very happy about the amount of market access we are getting, particularly with China. We have a fear that as we bring our tariffs down, our terms of trade with the remaining countries will actually get worse, not better. Whether this is actually true, I really can't say, but this appears to be among our apprehensions.
Right. So, closing comment from you, Ambassador Dasgupta, on the best way forward as far as this particular issue is concerned.
I think the RCEP negotiations are extremely important from India's point of view, because it will enable us to access a large number of markets. Of course, the additionality would be, in strictly speaking, in terms of China, Australia and New Zealand, because we have FTAs with ASEAN and with Japan and Korea in any case. But it will also enable us to be part of the global value chain, because 30% approximately of global trade originates in this region. So it would give us a leg up in terms of gaining global competitiveness, and in terms of course, technology transfers, in terms of investment flows. So this is something which we can't ignore. Right. But we have to look at our position, and the point that Ambassador Mukherjee made, that is very well taken, that with liberalization comes greater competitiveness in the domestic industry, but you have to create conditions suitable for enhancing our competitiveness. And I think now the time has come for making some very urgent reforms, taking some steps in that direction and addressing those issues, which
Sure.
will give comfort to our own industry, make them competitive and enable them to face up to challenges from the ASEAN plus China.
All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of India's World, but we'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it. See you again next time.